Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Charles Arthur.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
I'm very good, thanks, Molly.
That's good. So, can you tell me about your writing?
Sure. I've been a journalist for at least 3 decades now. So I started out writing about tennis for a tennis magazine. And then I was sort of doing that sort of part-time. Basically, I still had a job and I would go along to tournaments when I had some time off and write about them for a magazine. Then I got a full-time job, which actually was full-time journalism, writing for a trade paper in the computer section. I was there for a few years. Then I went to a magazine where I was writing about business, and that magazine was called Business. They're all quite sort of declarative. Mm-hmm. And then I got a job at the Independent newspaper in the UK, where I was a technology correspondent. Did that for about 10 years, and I covered technology, but I also was covering science. So I covered things like the BSE epidemic, which is also known as mad cow disease, and the human disease that followed on from it. It sort of makes me shudder to think what people would interpret it as now if that was to happen now. And after I left the Independent, I went to the Guardian newspaper, where I was the technology editor, editing a section of technology news, which would come out every week, also writing for the newspaper and for the website. I was there for about 10 years. And since 2010, I've written 3 books. My first one was about Apple, Google, and Microsoft. My second was about hacking. And my third is the one that's just come out, which is called Social Warming.
And I just finished reading Social Warming the other day, and I have to say, it is so good. Like, I really don't know very much about like this kind of darker side of social media. I have not learned a lot about the tech world. And this really was a great, it started off, I was like, oh, it's going to be kind of like an introduction. And then it really took it a step above. And I feel like I definitely learned a lot. Yeah. So, okay, kind of leading into my next question. With your being a journalist, how did that impact your books, and specifically Social Warming, writing a lot about how journalism has shifted with so many of the trends and all that stuff for it being online?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been around so long that I've seen journalism move from being on typewriters to being entirely on computers. And the rise of social media in line with it. And there's a real tension for journalists in particular about social media, because they're very aware that it can have really toxic effects, that you get people who are just there to argue, or not even to argue, actually, they're basically to sort of insult you. But at the same time, it's a fantastic medium for getting your message out. And at the same time as that, it can be distracting away from the publication that you're writing for. If you put something on Twitter, then a lot of people think, well, there's no point in actually clicking through and reading the story because I've seen it here. So there's a colossal tension for journalists about where should I be? What sort of pose should I strike on social media? And there is a general effect, which is what I call social warming, where people are sort of more intense about what they do. There's this need to do things faster and faster, that you sort of take the knocks and you just carry on with it. And especially on social media, people like to argue about stuff, as I say. And it's this way that people are all thrown together, that nothing seems to get resolved, but everyone's a bit angrier than they were, that I think is this process that I call social warming, that everyone seems to be a bit more angry. Everyone seems to be a bit more frustrated with everyone else, and yet nothing seems to get done.
Yeah, definitely. So can you share some tips for how you personally, and how you think that other people can avoid that frustration and avoid some of the more argumentative sides of the internet?
That's really, I'm not sure I'm the best person to do this, actually, because I just recognize in my character that I am quite argumentative. I have a sort of, I think it's sort of part of why I became a journalist, is that I feel there are certain things that are true, that you can find out things that are true, and that therefore you've sort of got a responsibility almost to tell people about those things. And I mean, I've also got a scientific background, and I think the combination of those things of sort of thinking, well, there are things that you can establish as true, and the sort of the journalism thing means that I have this terrible tendency to argue with people. I mean, the big thing is just to some extent tell yourself, all these people are idiots, and just step away from it. If you can do that, that works really well, but it can be very hard to do. And like I say, I recognize it myself. For example, I have a Facebook account, but I hardly ever go on the Facebook because I just don't feel any great value. I don't get any particular value from it.
Same.
But it's different for different people. I mean, I know women, for example, who find that Facebook is a terrific refuge because on Twitter they just get harassed and people being unpleasant to them, and I completely understand that actually you want places where you can feel that you've got friends around you, and Twitter isn't always welcoming like that. So it's a bit like the only way to win is not to play. And to some extent, you can use the filter systems on Facebook. You can choose who gets to see your posts. You can choose who you're allowed to be your friends. There's no one's awarding medals for having the most friends on Facebook. You don't actually win anything. So probably my first recommendation there would be, pick really carefully who actually you choose to be friends with. Pick really carefully who you're sharing stuff with. Ask yourself if if that's really where you get the value from. On Twitter, I'd say, there are controls where you can decide who gets to respond to stuff. Sometimes direct messaging is actually a much more pleasant way of discussing things with people because it's private in effect than saying things in public. But I'm completely aware that I do get dragged down into wanting to sort of be dogmatic and say, no, this thing is true, and other people say, well, this is not true, and it can very quickly spiral because there's a lot more people on the internet who are prepared to tell you that you're wrong than who are prepared to tell you that you're right.
Oh, very much so. And it's not kind of what you say in the book too a lot is you're not necessarily saying all social media needs to be outlawed forever and it is a horrible thing. And I really loved that about this because I feel like every other thing that I've ever seen that deals with the effects of social media pretty much just says it is the scourge of the earth and no one should ever go near it. And if you do, you're a bad person.
Yeah, it's very much sort of burn your phone, isn't it?
Yeah, yes. And I loved that in this book, as I was reading it, I was so happy because I was like, for me personally, and especially I'm sure many other people feel this way too, during this quarantine, being online and social media has helped me so much. But it also sucks and I don't want to be on it. And I love that you had that kind of the dichotomy between those two things.
Well, I mean, what I describe is that there's this 4-step process. So the first part is that it's entirely natural. As humans, we are tribal. It's just built into our personalities because that's how we survived as a species. We went through this period when there was a real bottleneck in the number of humans who actually existed on the earth. And the only way that you survive it is by being tribal, by throwing people out of the tribe where they go against the norms that are going to let you survive in the tribe. So you have the tribes and you have the outrage process. You're outraged at people who do bad things, and so you eject them. And so you get the people who are in the tribe and people who are out of the tribe. And outrage is the process by which you separate. So you have tribalism, second stage is the outrage. And the third stage, which the social networks are involved in, is the amplification part. Because the algorithms are just interested in, well, how are people engaging with stuff? What happens is people really engage with outrage because it's a thing that we're primed to notice. And if you look at Twitter and you sort of take a step back from it, then it's really easy to say, oh, look, there's an outrage tweet. Oh, look, there's someone being outraged about something. Sometimes they even just say it. They say, such and such has happened, and I am outraged. And you think, oh, there you go. There you are being tribal and outraged and amplified as well, because people will retweet it. So that's a sort of manual amplification. But also the algorithm will tend to show it to you because they say, oh, look, lots of people are engaging with this. And the algorithm, is working for the networks. It wants people to be spending time on the networks. So they spend the time there, they're not somewhere else, so they can show you adverts. And then the last step which really finishes off the social warming, which sort of bakes the cake, if you like, is that you have the indifference to moderation. The social networks don't want to get rid of this stuff that's outraging, that's causing pylons, because it's all good business for them if people do it. They don't mind if people are hurt, if people are upset. That's sort of not their fault. You got into this on your own. So there's this indifference to moderation that you see on Twitter and especially on Facebook when you get things like QAnon and so on. Which
free
has
speech.
this effect. Yeah, well, it's that's very much the problem, isn't it? And Mark Zuckerberg is, given that he rules over Facebook, has been a sort of a prime cause of this in not realizing that not all free speech actually has great benefits. If you add the tribalism, the outrage, and the amplification on top of it, then you have really bad effects. And that's one of the chapters in my book, is looking at Myanmar and what went on there when Facebook basically came into a country with no knowledge of what the whole free speech idea was about, because they lived under a military junta for years, and where there was no moderation, and things really went haywire very fast.
Oh yeah, and I might be blanking. It might also be Myanmar, but I can't remember the country's name. But when you were saying too that there are places where they don't have Google, but they have Facebook, and so they just search up everything on Facebook. And I was really thinking about that. And that could be so damaging, because they don't get journalists and all this stuff. They get their friends' opinions when they look it up. And it just, wow. I was really shocked by that.
It's very insidious. This is a sort of program called Facebook Basics, which will give you access to Facebook. It'll give you access to WhatsApp, because Facebook owns it, give you access to a lot of Instagram, might give you access to Wikipedia, maybe, but there's no access to Google, so no access to news sites. So yes, as you say, people find stuff but they don't see it. And actually you get examples of that in Myanmar, you get it in the Philippines, you get it in Brazil, you get it in parts of Africa. These are all countries and regions where we've seen big problems with misinformation, with political movements exploiting this sort of misinformation to push populist ideas, because there's no easy recourse. It's expensive to look up the facts, whereas it's cheap to find the lies.
Yeah, definitely. So what was your research like for this book? I can't even imagine all of the people that you would have had to talk to and all of the things that you would have had to read and look up and all this work you had to do for this.
I was doing a huge amount of reading. There were academic papers that I was hunting down and following through. So the whole tribalism and outrage thing, that all came from a paper that was published in Nature, which is one of the big 2 science journals. And then I was tracking around other papers about studies people had done about what happens if people give up using Facebook. What if you pay them not to use Facebook? And there's really interesting studies there where people who are paid not to use Facebook for a month were actually quite happy not to use it afterwards. It's one of those things where if you break the habit, it's a bit like smoking maybe, then actually it becomes easier not to come back to it. And I think the longer you spend away from it, the easier it is not to go back to it. And in that sense, it's very like an addictive behavior. I was talking to academics. I was talking to people in the field. I was talking to people who had worked at Facebook. I was talking as far as I could to the companies themselves, though they tend to be very unwilling to talk about things where they feel they might not be depicted as the most wonderful people in the world. Though, my point in the book is that none of this is actually malicious. The opening line of the book is nobody meant for this to happen. That it's all an accidental byproduct in a large way, rather like global warming is, an accidental byproduct of the fact that we all have these cars, we have these power plants, which bring us all these creature comforts that we love, but at the same time have the effect of completely disrupting the climate that we depend on. In the same way, social networks are really convenient for meeting people you've never met, but they have this disruptive effect on society where everyone's a bit angry, everyone's a bit more mistrustful of what they read. They don't like the MSM, as they call it. And, it becomes a bit more difficult to persuade groups of people about things that actually are very easy to demonstrate if only people would put a bit of faith in what you can prove is true.
Yeah. And it very much, well, like you say a lot in the book too, it's so polarizing. on there. And like, I've read stuff before. I've caught myself looking at an article or a tweet or something and going, oh yes, I fully agree with this person. And I'm like shocked and outraged. Then I take a step back and think if one of my friends came up to me and said that, I would have called them crazy. Like, but because you read it in this format, it like trains your brain in a different way. And yeah.
Very much. I mean, the polarizing thing is something to really be aware of it. It happens even without the amplification. So there are examples, again, which I show in the book, where you have closed groups of people. And it's actually a well-studied phenomenon by a guy called Cass Sunstein, which goes back to the 1990s, predates the wider use of the internet. Did you get a group of people together in a room who sort of agree a bit about a particular topic? It might be gun control, it might be gun rights, take whatever side of a subject you want. If they all agree on it and you get them to start talking about it, saying, what we should do, what should we do about gun control or gun rights, they'll all shift towards a more extreme view of what they thought before. And that happens naturally. That happens on WhatsApp groups, which doesn't have amplification. But if you add a social network in with algorithmic amplification, then it gets much worse, and it happens much more quickly. And we see it now. We've gone from a position where people were perhaps a bit ambivalent about vaccines to one where people are absolutely certain what their position on vaccines is, one way or the other. And it's very difficult to persuade them to change their view at all. And one of the difficult things, one of the rarest people in the world maybe is the person who's prepared to change their mind about something that they thought before.
Yeah. And especially in this day and age, it has become like nothing at all. And like you're saying earlier, that people are naturally argumentative and naturally like form these tribes. And then adding this in, it's all gone haywire.
Well, yeah, and the other thing, of course, is that once you're behind a computer screen, you're safe. No one's going to come and punch you in the face for being incredibly rude to them. So all that adds up and makes people feel that there are no consequences to what they say. So the discourse gets even more debased.
Definitely. So how did this project start? Like, how did you get the idea for all of this?
I was doing a lecture at the University of Cambridge. They wanted me to talk about whether politics affects technology or technology affects politics. And I had been looking at the results of the 2016 US presidential election, where a tiny number of votes in 3 different states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, made the complete difference to the result. Which is partly a quirk of the American electoral system. But also, it seemed to me that the flipping of these states by the small number of votes where Donald Trump's campaign had focused a lot of Facebook advertising spend, that seemed to me one of these examples. Again, rather like global warming, small changes can have big effects. You think that 0.1 of a centigrade in temperature difference is not going to make much difference, but it's the difference between ice and water. It's that sort of little effect which has a big effect. And I got thinking, well, this sort of effect that they have with all the Facebook adverts tips things over by a few thousand votes here. It's not a gigantic effect, but it is an effect. And I started looking around for other examples of the way that social networks functioned, and it all started to come together over really a period of years that I was thinking about it and just trying to gather the sort of evidence and the framework for it. And so I was writing it from the end of 2019 and through our lockdown in 2020 and published now.
Yeah. And I kind of want to circle back to talk a little bit more about how social media played into the 2016 election and into other elections. And because I know people who were not as polarized, but just did not vote because they, in that election specifically, because they were like, nope, there's too much disinformation on both sides. And they just completely wrote it off because of how polarized. Can you talk a little bit about those sort of effects and how that's working in other countries?
Sure. I mean, 2016, people think that the US election was the first example, but actually there had been an election earlier in the year in the Philippines where there was a surprise winner in the form of Rodrigo Duterte, and they had used Facebook. His party had used Facebook very effectively for disinformation campaigns. In the UK, in June of that year, we had the Brexit referendum, as it's called. Which was a referendum on whether we should be part of the European Union. And Facebook, again, was used very effectively there by the Vote Leave campaign to gin up people who had never voted before in some cases. But they knew they were on Facebook. They knew that they could reach them with the right messages. They knew they could motivate them. And, the Trump campaign, similarly, they realized there was this new tool that they could use to motivate people. Equally, there was a lot of Russian disinformation going around, and in the 2016 election, the US election, that was specifically aimed at a lot of colored voters, aiming to tell them, there's no point in doing, what's going to happen here is going to get in, you're going to hate her. So in that sense, it was used against the American electorate. Quite some irony that a tool developed in the States could be used against its own electorate. But yeah, these are the sort of malicious effects that you see. And those sorts of things happen in other countries too. It's been used, I write in the book about how it's used in South Africa against voters there, where some people from outside the country tried to do it. There are examples in other countries in Africa. It's a really common form of misinformation, disinformation, to effectively have outside state interference mediated through Facebook.
Yeah. And it's really shocking. Like I said before, as somebody that did not know much about this, only knew vaguely, Facebook sucks. That like to hear about all of these different things and all of the ways that it has affected every part of society. So how did you decide what to keep and what to cut in this book? Because I can imagine that would be a lot, especially since it's like all of the internet you're discussing.
Well, yeah, my experience as a journalist down the years has sort of taught me to, that you write a lot and then you throw a lot away. And that's quite a consistent pattern. I mean, the first chapter that I actually wrote out in full and sort of printed out to read, because you've got to print it out to read it properly. You can't do it on the screen, was the one about Myanmar. And I did write that and looked at it, and I was reading through thinking, this is terrible. Who wrote this? Geez, it's just all over the place. But once you have that, then you start to feel, okay, this is how the flow of it should go. So I had a chapter structure, and I then actually sent it to my editor at One World Publishing, Cecilia Stein, and she actually suggested restructuring for it. We dropped one chapter entirely, which was looking at children, how social media affects children. So the result is, I think, a much more coherent book, which I'm really happy with. She did a great job in pointing out what things should be in it, what things shouldn't be in it. This is a thing that a good editor does. They really show you what to include and where the reasoning is weak, where it needs strengthening, where you need to really bear down on something. That's what good editors do.
Yeah, and this book, it's really amazing. And I never felt like there was a section that could be cut out, and that's part of why I asked that question too, because you read some books and it's like, okay, you could have cut out this entire whole section of it. You could have completely cut out half the book. I never felt that during any of these chapters. And I think that really was a feat, especially for something that's all about such a sprawling topic.
Thanks. I mean, that's really kind. Though, I mean, I think partly that comes out of doing the years and years of journalism. One thing that daily news journalism teaches you is not to waste words. And in the UK, particularly, the newspaper trade is brutal. You write something that's 10 words too long in the first paragraph, and those 10 words are gone. And you're taught not to waste any space. The suggestion is it actually comes through there having been a shortage in newsprint during the Second World War. There wasn't much space to get your story in, so you had to be really precise, and that's just been handed down the years in the UK newspaper trade. So you get taught not to be repetitious, not to be circumlocution, not to waste the reader's time. And I guess maybe it rubbed off, but it's also having the good editor.
Mm-hmm. But this book was really excellent. I can definitely see the journalism background in it. I think that was about all the questions I had for today. I just have one more, and that is, what do you have coming up?
I'm sort of doing various freelance articles at the moment. I mean, I have an idea for a book which is about the people who are trying to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, because the whole, focusing on global warming, which is the real problem we have, it's not enough just to stop putting in carbon into the atmosphere. You've actually got to remove it to stop things all really overheating. The trouble is, it looks like there isn't anyone who's going to succeed, and I'm sort of slightly worried about that. So I'm wondering how feasible the book becomes, But that's sort of the broad project I'm thinking about.
That would be really interesting. Well, let me know and come back on the show, and then I'll read it and I'll talk to you about that one too, because that sounds really excellent. All right. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Charles Arthur.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. This episode is hosted by Molly Southgate. It is edited by Rob Southgate and produced by Southgate Media Group. You can get in touch with the show at readbetweenthelines@gmail.com, or you can send us a voicemail at 708-887-9473. That was 708-887-9473. You can also find us on Instagram at Read Between the Lines Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.